Hello and welcome to the FPL Summer Camp. Today we have got Ross is back again, FPL Raptor. He's going to tell us a little bit about some of the research he's done. He's already told me a little bit before we started recording, but he's going to tell us a little bit of stuff he's found out about position changes. Messed this up already. Position changes, which I think is going to be a really interesting topic going into the next season. So how are you doing, Ross? You all good?
Yep, good to be back. Thank you for having me back on the channel. I appreciate it.
That's all right. You're providing me more content than I'm providing myself at the moment. So, you're all good. And I also thought we'd bring on Eddie, FPL Phillips, a man who makes very good YouTube videos when he can be bothered. Your social media game at the moment is pretty good. I've been enjoying your price prediction stuff on Twitter and Instagram. So it's good to have you on as well. You've actually been on this channel before, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. I've been. The YouTube is coming back. Don't worry about that. the balance in the uni has been a nightmare in exam season and whatnot. But going to be the best comeback of all time.
Wicked. Well, I'm sure we're all looking forward to it. Right, let's get started. Like I said, we're going to talk about player position changes because I know there's been a lot of rumours that there will be some changes. I think all of us probably heard it first being said with quite a lot of confidence from Mark Southerns. Mark Southerns, kind of the godfather of FPL content, I suppose, fantasy football scout guy, and he's absolutely convinced that there is going to be some significant player position changes, particularly moving some midfielders to the forward position. So I want to talk first of all about the criteria. What is going to make a player move from a midfield slot to a forward slot? What is the difference between a Kane and a Salah, and why should we put a Salah alongside a Kane in that kind of position? So why would we change a player? What kind of player would we change and why? Ross, do you want to start us off?
Yes, it's a really tricky one. I think it's due to the advance in tactics that we've seen recently. We've got these almost like hybrid positions. We've got the likes of like Reece James and Trent almost. I suppose Reece James more so playing in a 5-back. But these players where they're not quite a defender, they're a midfielder. And then we go to the forwards and we've got some players that are playing, you could class it as an inside forward or a narrow winger. And it's really tricky. It's almost like FPL needs maybe like 7 or 8 different categories for positioning. But I just think that gets a little bit too complicated. So I would be extremely surprised if FPL change it away from defenders, midfielders, attackers, or defenders, midfielders and forwards. But they're going to have a difficulty with those players that really float between the categories, the likes of Salah and Son. I think the easiest way to do it would just be to be the position that they start in the lineup. So when you see the formations go live, when the teams go live, if they're starting on the wing, they're a winger in like a 4-3-3. But the issue is that in the game, it doesn't play out like that. So I think maybe something that could be interesting is the average position, which takes the average position that they take up on the pitch across the 90 minutes. The other one is some sort of touch map. But again, touch maps are pretty tricky because, for example, Kane's touch map would be very deep, but he spends the majority of his time in a forward position. So again, it's a tricky one. He might touch the ball quite deep and they might touch the ball out wide, but it might be that they spend the majority of the time on the back of the defence. So there are various ways that we could do it. FPL need to be consistent with it, I suppose, is the main thing. But I think that potentially it's too basic to just say if they're starting on the wing in a 4-3-3, they're a midfielder. Because like I said, some of those players tend to drift more centrally and more further forward during the game.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. I do agree that the consistency is the key, and I'm sure we kind of again all agree that the game has evolved. A winger is not the winger of 10, 15 years ago when the basic rules of FPL for first launched. A David Beckham as a winger is not the same as a Mo Salah as a winger. They're kind of very different players. I don't know, Eddie, what's your thoughts on this one?
Well, it's very difficult. It's a very tricky situation because once you start moving one winger, in which we're seeing, much more of these 4-3-3 formations, less of the kind of lone or 2-striker formations in the modern game. And traditionally, FPL have just those forwards have been either lone strikers or people who play in a front two. And so the moment you move Salah or someone like that, there's an argument that comes in like, do you move Bowen? Do you move Saka? Do you move all these wingers have to move up to the forward slot in theory, or they're going to be equally we only have 3 forward slots in our FPL teams. That's not going to change, I don't think. So we only have 3. If we have that many to pick from up there, it's going to be a nightmare. And then in midfield, from like true midfield, as you would say, so CDMs, like centre mids, number 10s, etc., then you're going to have 5 to pick from what we'd say is a pretty lacklustre set of midfielders, rather than actually the ones you want, like the big hitters, and choosing between those. So I think it does become very complicated when you start moving up the likes of Salah. And, Son is more likely, I'd say, because we've seen him kind of in that front two with Kane. But Kulusevski comes in, and then people say, should he be moving up? He shouldn't really, should he? So should Son be moving up as a result of his starting position on the team sheets? You'd say no, but his heat map would suggest he should. So it's interesting what you go with. I don't really see FPL changing it. I don't think they're going to move away from wingers in midfield, maybe making them a bit more expensive. Like, they're already really expensive, as we know, but even so, I think wing-backs like Reece James, like Trent, can be made even more expensive, and that does, basically, we want to change it so that we have the biggest dilemma possible with starting our FPL teams, because that's what makes it the most exciting and the most difficult to pick from, and ultimately ends up with people having different teams, and the game's more fun.
Definitely. I think there are a few criteria that they could use. I think one that hasn't been mentioned is, I know it's a little bit more maybe subjective, but potentially moving a player based on their role in the team. So, for example, Salah's role in the Liverpool team is to score goals primarily. Assists for, creativity for Salah is very, very much a secondary thing. Whereas maybe, we talk about, do we move like a Saka into that position? Although Saka does score goals for Arsenal, you wouldn't say that is his, it's obviously one of his primary roles, but it's not, the out and out primary role. He's also there to, put some crosses in the box, passing, do a little bit of defensive work when needed. So although he does score goals, his role in the team isn't a forward, but that's very, very subjective, and I don't really know how you would apply that consistently. So I think there's going to be a few people upset if they were to move some players and not others, maybe.
Yeah, I think like you say, the issue there is with subjectivity. So again, going back to what Mark Sevens said, and just so you know, for anyone watching this that doesn't know Mark Sevens, he used to work for the Premier League, and one of his main roles within FPL was around player prices and player positions. And he said that every single year they asked, since Salah's come to the Premier League, every single year they've asked the same question: does Salah become a forward? And he just thinks, due to what we saw last season, it might push them over the edge. And I'm not necessarily saying just Salah, but it might force them to just make a few changes. And one of the things that he says could be done, if you don't know, again, Premier League and FPL get their statistics. So for goals and assists, when people blame FPL, it's often coming through Opta. So they get their stats fed through Opta. So what Mark suggested is maybe they just follow what Opta say for some of these players, and they just go really, really objective. If Opta call them a forward, they're a forward. If Opta call them a winger, they call them a winger. So that could be another way of doing it. But again, some of these players are classed as maybe a midfielder. For example, I believe Son is classed as a winger on Opta, but is he actually a winger? Probably not. So I don't think there's a good way to do this. I think whatever you do, whether you keep it the same or whether you make loads of changes or only a few, you're going to upset someone. And that's always the case when FPL make these changes. And these are the things that they've got to think about. They've got to keep the general casual database happy, but also keep the engaged managers happy, because we're the ones that drive this game forward, the engaged managers. So it's very, very tricky for them to make this decision, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really frustrating one because you can't just throw them all up there. I think the consistency is going to be the biggest problem, and I don't know what the backlash would be if just one or two players randomly move to forwards just because they score a lot of FPL points. That kind of seems a little bit against the spirit of FPL to move players because they score a lot of points. Maybe. I don't know. I did want to throw up one other interesting question before we start talking about specific players, and that is the wing backs. Because if you look on a lot of websites or where formations are listed and stuff like that, in a what we might call a 5-3-2 formation or a 5-2-3 formation, is actually a kind of a 3 at the back, really. And the wing back, so for example, let's just talk about Chelsea, for example. Reece James on one side, Ben Chilwell on the other side. When you look at their lineup, their starting positions, they are playing in midfield. When you look at any kind of website that's listing the lineups, they are playing as the left and right midfielders. Are these players actually midfielders? Is there any argument to moving wing-backs into midfield positions? Eddie, what do you think about that?
I personally don't think that he should. There's certainly an argument for it, but I think the role of a wing-back in the role of defence in a team means that they should have the benefit of the clean sheet points that the rest of the defence are getting. And, whether that means that CDMs, who you'd say are just arguably just as involved in the defensive solidity of a team, are kind of being a bit screwed out of it in midfield, then you start going into whether CDMs need extra clean sheet points or whatever when that kind of goes into subdivision. So it's a very tricky kind of issue to solve. What I personally think should happen is that CDMs at the moment are kind of a bit, we know they're rubbish. A £5 million defender is worth way more than a £5 million midfielder in FPL. The selection's pretty awful. We only really use them as bench fodder. I think bringing in something like the UCL, like the Euro format of the ball recoveries, and having some maybe one or two more elements in there that make CDMs better to own does kind of solve that. It makes CDMs better, but keeps them as a midfielder, and wing backs I think just should be made more expensive due to kind of that extra price, so you can decide whether you're going to sacrifice some funds in midfield in order to go with them at the back, because moving them into midfield I think is tricky when it comes to them only having one clean sheet point. Would feel a bit hard done by, I think. Yeah,
definitely. Ross, you look like you want to jump in here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you've either got to make wing-backs a lot more expensive, and I mean, I'm not talking 0.5, I'm talking maybe Reece James at 6.57, Trent up at 8.5, or you just make centre-backs a lot cheaper. So if we see Laporte and Rudiger, if Rudiger's not going to stay, but Laporte down at 5.5, if we see these premium centre-backs, Van Dijk maybe down to 6.5, that makes you think, well, if I can save 2.5 going for Van Dijk over Trent, maybe I'd do that. Or if I can save, again, if Cancelo's at 7 and Laporte's at 5.5, he never would be, but if I can save 1.5 million going for Laporte, what we need in FPL, and this is the whole point about these player position changes, we need FPL to give us decisions to make. I really don't want the game to go live, to watch Dan's video, to watch Eddie's video, and for me to have the same draft. That would really frustrate me. This year in particular, with all of these new players coming to the Premier League, Núñez, Haaland, there are so many players to choose from. If they get the pricing right, I genuinely think this could be the year where we see such different teams. I think we could see, like for example, Dan and I think our teams could genuinely differ by 8 to 10 players if they get the pricing right. So I don't think it's as much as trying to actually recreate what is real, because I do think that the wing-backs should probably be midfielders. They play further forward than they do in defend. But for the sake of the game, I think that would ruin it slightly. So I think they just need to get these pricings right so that we have very different teams. And I think that would really, really spice up FPL. And I think that would get more people involved, because last year at times, especially in the first few weeks, the reason everyone did so well in the FPL community is everyone had the same team. Benrahma, Antonio, Trent, Shaw, everyone had, and it was a bit boring. So I'd like to see that, and I think for them, all they need to be thinking about, rather than actually recreating what is in real life the Premier League, I think they need to think about how can we force people to make very, very difficult decisions.
I get what you're saying, and I would definitely think that would be more fun. I would love it if everyone had completely different teams. That would be infinitely more fun. But I wonder if we're perhaps saying that from the kind of perspective of people who already really love FPL. If you're coming into FPL as a new player, in all likeliness, you're probably just going to want to say, I really want Salah, and I want Haaland, and I want Son, and I want all of these amazing players in my fantasy team so I can support all of these fantastic players. Similar to, FIFA Ultimate Team, for example. The whole goal of FIFA Ultimate Team is to pack your team with amazing players, because that's what people find exciting, maybe, just to have all of the best players. And I feel like that's kind of the model that FPL have been using for a time now, giving people the opportunity to just have all of their favourite players. But you're so right. This is the opportunity. Haaland coming into the team, to the Premier League is going to be absolutely huge. Núñez as well coming in now potentially. That could be pretty interesting. It could go pretty wild. Honestly, I'm kind of excited for it.
I just hope they don't get. I just hope they don't get too carried away from last year. And this is something that we'll discuss in our YouTube videos. Every season's different, and every other season, forwards have been very, very useful. And I don't want them to get carried away and think we've had one season where the forwards weren't great, and all of a sudden we're going to make everyone else forwards to try and get around that. Because I genuinely think next year, Watkins, Mitrovic, Richarlison, if Calvert-Lewin either moves to Arsenal or stays for Everton, these are players that could do fairly well. And I just think that if they get carried away and move all the midfielders to forwards, we're just going to have a situation where we're struggling to pick midfielders because there aren't that many great ones to choose from. So I hope they don't get carried away. I do hope that they move a few players, which we'll get onto in the next section. I hope there are a few players that move, but I think they need to find that balance again. And they probably have the biggest job that they've had in a long while for this FPL game. They've talked about making differences with chips, different things to add. They've sent out that survey. They've got all of these player prices, player positions. It's a big task. I mean, it might mean that the game's slightly delayed. People are saying it will go live very soon. I don't know that, but they've got a lot to do and a lot of key decisions to make, I think.
Eddie, any closing thoughts before we start talking about some specific players?
I get what Ross is saying, definitely with regards to the forwards. It's been a disaster year for them in terms of FPL prospects, and it's important that we don't get carried away because it's easy to forget. Ross talks a lot about recency bias, and we've got recency bias with regards to how forwards are looking as FPL options recently. The only real the top two scorings were massive premiums at Kane and Ronaldo. So I think it's important that we don't get carried away. One thing I saw that was interesting was perhaps making it so that goal points are equal for midfielders and attackers, so 5 points universally, and maybe even for defenders as well, because as we know, the wing-backs getting forward, they get 6 points for a goal, whereas a forward gets 4. That's quite a significant difference. So if we make it 5 points, not only does it make it more simple, and also playing around with the bonus points, which of course at the moment are in favour of forwards, but could be balanced out if necessary. I think might make the game more simple and ultimately will make the wing backs less appealing, which we're kind of looking to, but we're hypothesising to change that with price and making the forwards more appealing by giving them that extra benefit, so that Salah scoring a goal gets the same benefit as Kane scoring a goal, which you would expect really based on their positions in game.
Okay, so basically what we're saying is that maybe it's not the positions that need to change, but maybe potentially the pricing of players and the point scoring of players that could actually solve a problem, without having to go into the realms of inconsistency or of kind of moving players' positions. Maybe that is the solution. Maybe I've titled this video wrong. Maybe we're coming at this at the complete wrong angle, and that's actually what we should be doing, or FPL should be doing, maybe. I don't know. But this video is titled player position changes, so let's talk about a couple of players who I think a lot of people are going to want to know about. So I think the big one is Salah. Like you said, Ross, FPL have apparently been talking about for years about moving Salah to the forward position. Why would we do that? Why would we move Salah to the forward position, specifically him?
Yeah, so I think by all accounts, most people would class Salah as maybe an inside forward as opposed to a winger. But by that wording, he is a forward. It's a tricky one. He is that hybrid position. The reason that I think Salah will not be moved to a striker, and again, this goes against Mark Suddens, who seems to be convinced that Salah is going to become a forward. I think he hugs the wing far too often during the game. So Salah's average position off the ball when Liverpool are in attack is about as wide as you can possibly get. And this is the eye test, this is touch maps, this is whatever you want to use, statistics, average positions. So he hugs the wing very wide. But when they get really close to the box, or when he's on the ball, he tends to drift a little bit more centrally and he gets those touches in the box. So for me, if it's a real debate as to should they be moved, shouldn't they be moved, they tend to play quite wide off the ball. For me, that's just not enough to make them a forward. So I just don't think that, and I think equally, in comparison to Spurs, who we'll get onto, I think Diaz and Jota, whoever plays on that left, plays a very, very similar role to Salah. And are you just going to say that you're going to make every Liverpool attacker a forward in that case? So it'll be Jota, Diaz, Nunez, Firmino, Salah. All of these guys are going to be forwards. They're going to have no midfielders to choose from. So I don't think it's out the realms of possibility, but I just think that looking at the way that Salah plays and the fact that he does hug the wing off the ball, I personally think that Salah will stay as a midfielder, in my opinion.
Eddie, Salah, midfielder or forward, and why?
I agree with Ross. He'll stay as a midfielder for that exact same reasons. Really, he just plays too wide, and once you set that precedent of moving one Liverpool forward, you basically have to move all of them. And then instead of those in midfield, we've got to pick from Henderson and Fabinho, and that kind of like I mentioned earlier with the 5 slots in midfield and the 3 forward slots. That's going to be an absolute nightmare, and it's going to make the game less fun ultimately if you want to own 6 of those forwards that are up there, and you've only got 3 slots, and you only want to own 2 of the midfielders that are in there, and you've got to pick 5. It would be a nightmare, and I definitely don't see them changing the amount of players we have in each position. So I think it does, as I kind of said, sets a difficult precedent. And also because Salah is so good, other people play that similar role in teams further down the table, but perhaps don't score as many points. So we talk about Salah a lot and moving him, but then we'll kind of ignore the players that further down the league, and kind of, because we're not seeing these ridiculous scores from them. But once you move Salah, you've then got to move all those if you're doing it based on the position, not just based on, oh, he's scoring loads of points, so perhaps he shouldn't be getting that extra point for a goal, that clean sheet point. Let's move him. But we forget about the players that, we might want to end up owning further down, and that could lead to some inconsistency. So I think Salah will stay as a midfielder. Most likely probably 13 million or maybe even 13.5 million, I think, would be probably a fair price based on last year's performance. But yeah, I do see him staying in midfield.
Wow. Well, I actually came into this video thinking, yeah, Salah's probably going to move to forward, but I think the pair of you have convinced me maybe that he is going to stay as a midfielder. But yes, at that inflated price, 13 million, 13.5 million, whatever it takes to make people make a decision. Because I think what we're saying is Salah is a midfielder. He's just a midfielder who is crazy good at scoring FPL points and therefore should be priced accordingly. Makes sense to me. So by that logic, Diaz on the other side, Mane if he stays, midfielders too. Maybe not Mane. He was playing kind of as more of a striker, wasn't he, towards the end of the season? But he's probably off anyway, so maybe no point speaking about him. But what about Jota? Because he kind of has played in that central position, and centralism has kind of been the criteria for a long time. So what do you think about Jota?
Yeah, I think Jota's got to be a forward, but I was trying to do some research looking on all these different sites, Infogol Live. They've all got him listed as an attacking midfielder, Jota, and I think one had him as a winger. No one had him as a forward, and I thought that was really interesting because for me, he's an out-and-out forward. And Liverpool, with Firmino in the team, Liverpool play a false 9 formation. We've seen that for years. Firmino plays it to a T. Jota plays as a number 9. He doesn't play as a false 9. He plays very, very centrally. He's getting almost 10 touches in the box per 90. He's an out-and-out number 9 when he's playing that Liverpool front 3. The only slight issue is obviously Darwin Núñez coming in. Obviously, he's going to play through the middle when he gets integrated into the team. The issue is that Klopp tends to integrate these players quite slowly. So I think Jota will start the season up top, assuming that Mane leaves. I think they've got to list him as a forward, but it might be that we see him on the left a little bit more next season. So yeah, I think him along with Havertz, these sort of players that have played centrally in a number 9 position, they have to be listed as a forward.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. All right. Well, maybe we'll leave the Liverpool players then, because I think that makes sense. Wingers in the Liverpool system stay as midfielders, and central players go to forwards. That's how it's always been, and maybe it should stay that way. But a player that is a little bit different is Son, and I'm going to throw this over to FPL Phillips first of all. Should Son be listed as a forward? Because that is a slightly different situation to Salah, I think, in terms of the position they play on the field.
Yeah, I think he's more likely to be listed as a forward than Salah is. I think the players like Jota, that we just touched on, and Havertz, who have had most of their starts through the middle of the pitch, will definitely be listed, or should definitely be listed as forwards. Whereas Son's a bit of a more tricky one, I would argue. Like with Salah, he's scoring ridiculous amounts of points in the midfield, which is a cause for wanting us to move him up to forward, and I think there's a better argument for it. If you look at Son's heat maps, if you look at where he is on the pitch, and there's been different scenarios with Kulusevski coming into the team where it has changed, but overall he's just up there and so much more advanced than Kane at a lot of times when you do look at player heat maps and whatnot. And so I do think that even though traditionally sometimes he might not be starting in out and out in a front 2, I think that he is more likely to change. Would I change him personally? It's very difficult to say. I'm more inclined to keep Son as a midfielder because I just feel like it does come down to subjectivity. If we're looking at the front 3 for Spurs of Kulusevski, Kane and Son, then I think you kind of just, as much as it is tricky, just keep Kane as the forward and leave the other 2 in midfield. But like with Salah, make Son expensive, to be honest.
I think the argument there against that, though, is just that the Spurs attack is a little bit more messy. Kulusevski does not push forward as much. Kane drops in. Son comes in centrally. So much of the time, the only time Son is really wide on the pitch is when he's taking corners, which may affect his average position, his touch map or whatever. But most of the time, he's pretty much in the middle, even though he's not his starting position, but he kind of ends up there most of the time, I think. What do you think, Ross?
True.
Yeah, for me, Son, I think he's got to be a striker. He's playing as a number 9 throughout the game. Again, looking at touch maps, looking at average position, just looking at eye test. If you're not interested in touch maps, that's absolutely fine. Eye test tells you that a lot of the time he's further forward than Kane, and I think you've got a spot on that Kulusevski actually kind of drops in and deep. And you can see this on the touch map as well. Kane drops deep, and I think at sometimes you've almost got like a triangle, and you've got Kane and Kulusevski just behind Son, and Son's the furthest forward. And I don't think there would be massive backlash if they make Son a forward, but they keep Kulusevski, Salah, Diaz, all of these other players as midfielders, because I do think that Son stands alone, and I do think that Son is a second striker. I wouldn't class Son as an inside forward. I'd class him as either a striker or a second striker. So I wouldn't have any issue if they made Son a forward and kept the rest of these other wingers, for example, the Man City wingers as well, as midfielders.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I think, kind of agree with that, to be honest. All right, one more question about Son. If Son and Kane are both listed as forwards, let's say 12 million, who are you taking?
That's such a difficult one to answer.
So I've in a video I've just recorded, I've actually got Son. I think it'll be as a forward, but I think he'll be 0.5 cheaper than Kane, which a lot of people are going to disagree with. I've seen a lot of people say that Son should be more expensive than Kane. Kane is still on penalties, and Kane is still a striker, and he is still Kane, right? And Son is fantastic, excellent finisher. Son's data last year was slightly better than Kane's underlying wise, but neither of them were fantastic. They're both just clinical finishers. But I think due to penalties, and due to the fact that we could at any point see Son play a little bit wider, which we've seen in past seasons, he plays as a forward and then he drifts a little bit wider, I think I would still go for Kane. At 0.5 more, though, that's a decision to be had. I think they've got to put Kane slightly more. I think if Son and Kane are the same price, I think I would actually start with Son, even though Kane has the pens.
Eddie, what are you thinking?
I would start with Son, I think. I think he might take free kick duties probably next season as well, from what we've been seeing in the recent days. And I think overall, like we've said, with the heat maps and him often playing more advanced than Kane, he does tend himself to getting bag loads of FPL points. And I know Kane has outscored Son on a few occasions, but overall this last season we've been seeing, even if it weren't for the extra goal point and the clean sheet point, he would be outscoring him. I just like the way that Son plays a lot more in terms of being an FPL asset. I find it really frustrating to own Kane when he's dropping so deep as well, which also doesn't help with my enjoyment of the game. When you own a player who's listed as a forward and drifting back so deep into midfield, it's more exciting to own Son. And I know that, we shouldn't always base our decisions off that, but I like having my FPL team fun and enjoy watching the players that I want to own. And so even if they were both at the same price, I'd maybe consider probably owning Son over Kane, just for that reason, and for the fact that I think he's tended just to get forward and get the goals and get the attacking returns.
That'll definitely be a decision to make. I think, if we thought last season there was a lot of, split decisions based on Son versus Kane, if they're both forwards, I think it could go, even more crazy, potentially there. But yeah, so interested to see what happens there, to be honest. Is there any other players that you can think of that are interesting? Because obviously we could say Stuart Dallas will probably move from midfield to defence, but I mean, who cares? Maybe people who played FPL a couple of years ago might, think, oh, is this going to happen again? It's not. But yeah, is there any other players you can think of that are kind of interesting in terms of position changes?
Yeah, I think the only interesting one for me would be Phil Foden, just because he played quite a few games in the false 9 position. The only issue we've got is that he played a close amount to equaler games at left wing, and then he played a couple on the right wing. And due to the fact that Haaland's signing, I'm almost certain they'll keep him as a midfielder. However, if they did make him a forward, there's justification for it. But yeah, like I said, because he played a few on the left, also due to the fact that Haaland's joining, I just think he'll probably play more games on the wing next season. So assuming that they keep sort of Mahrez, Sterling, all of these wingers for Man City as midfielders, I think they've got to keep Foden as a midfielder. I think, again, they make Foden interesting by the price, and I think anything more than 8.5, and we're just going to go for KDB and Haaland. But yeah, that'll be an interesting one, I think. And then Havertz, I suppose, he's got to be a forward, you'd think, unless they think that Lukaku's going to start playing and he's going to play off the left again. So Havertz be an interesting one. Again, that comes down to pricing. I would say that I think the interesting thing about making the likes of Jota, Havertz, maybe Foden forwards, is that we're going to finally get some decent forwards in that £8 to £10 million price bracket, which we just haven't had for a while now. I mean, last season we had Gabriel Jesus at points, but we didn't really own him at the right points. We had Werner for like 2 games, and he was pretty shocking when we did eventually bring him in. We haven't had anyone. It's been sort of that 7.5 Watkins, Richarlison, Calvert-Lewin, or you go for Kane or Ronaldo. This season, hopefully, by changing a few of these players, we're going to actually have some players. And again, if I think Vardy's price might drop down to about 10 million, just because of his injury record and what we saw last season. I think we might hopefully get a few players in that price bracket between 8 and 10 million that might be perfect to pick next season.
Oh, that would be mad. Can you think of anyone else, Eddie?
Well, I mean, there's an argument for Gabriel Jesus, who played a lot off the wing last season as well. When you look at Phil Foden and consider changing him up, do you change Jesus back? But I don't think that overall that he should be moved. There's also like Havertz, but that's pretty convincing that Havertz played so many of his games in the number 9 position, over 60% of his games as a number 9, which is similar to Jota and more than Foden. So I think Havertz and Jota will no doubt be moved. Foden, I think, is the most interesting one, who perhaps people are on the fence more about. But yeah, I think ultimately he'll stay as a midfielder.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, let's wrap this up then, guys. I think that's a really interesting discussion. I'd love to hear, guys, in the comments section as well. What do you think? Who's going to move positions? Why? Make some arguments. Give us some pushback. Give us some debate. That'll be interesting. Guys, make sure you like the video. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you subscribe to FPL Raptor and FPL Phillips. Their links are going to be at the top of the description and in the end screen as well, of course. A part of this series is trying to give some shout-outs to some of other creators that I really like in the FPL community. So, yeah, thanks so much, guys, for coming on. Appreciate it. Giving me content.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having us.
No worries, and I'm sure we'll get you back for some more episodes over the summer. But that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you later, mates. Bye.